The repressive actions and new African collective identity. That's where we're at. Chapter 5. All right. 183. Yep, 183. Exactly. Another communist. Oh gosh. Yeah. And you have Cuban flags there. Another communist, but I have Cuban flags in my thing. Lived on communism? I never lived on communism. Who lives on communism? Free Cuba from the United States embargoes and sanctions. Let Cuba have their own self-determination and rights to be able to, freely dictate how they want their community and society wants to go. Maybe if you remove those sanctions and embargoes that we pay billions to for the United States government just to keep them subjugated and oppressed and suppressed is like not a good thing. So maybe if the United States stopped doing interventions and stuff, maybe Cuba can thrive better and have better conditions that are pushed upon them due to sanctions and embargoes. So you can kick rocks, buddy. You can kick rocks. We have one political party here. They're both capitalist political parties. That's all they are. One party, bro. Man, please read books. Read books. Repressive actions of the New African collective identity at war. New Africans claim that the United States has been waging war against African people for decades, if not centuries. Quote, warfare is a useful framework for examining repressive action. War is a struggle between two or more groups that can be, and typically is, associated with the recognized state of armed conflicts. Thus, we often frame it in ways that bring the carnage of U.S. soldiers in Vietnam and their combat in Afghanistan to mind. However, war is more expansive than the horrors of napalm and unmanned fighter drones. In many cases, such as the protracted battles between oppressed groups and their oppressors, war goes undeclared, as nothing more or less than active struggle or antagonisms between two or more entities or competing forces. Combatants develop various ways of waging struggle. War can be blatantly physical, like the examples mentioned earlier, or it may seem more as an ideological, quote, Cold War. Regardless, harm reaches out beyond those who are cautiously participating to determine the fate of innocent children, non-invested captives, and those who may seek refuge from it. Its physical impact is always felt, even if not completely understood. It undermines people's humanity and limits their chances to achieve the best possible life for themselves and their loved ones. Finally, war has a noticeable impact on the way future generations remember it. Even if the quote winners of the war chooses not to tell the story, they regulate how the quote losers remember disseminated that story. All of these characteristics of war are present in the history of the New African Independence Movement. In the Article 3 briefs, Amir Abdel writes that the centuries-old war in America, quote unquote, includes the kidnapping, brutal dominance, thorough mental, physical, and sexual abuse, SA, and theft of labor that came with enslavement. The war did not end with the promulgation of the Emancipation Proclamation and the ratification of the 13th Amendment. Instead, he argues in the aftermath of those two legal acts, the U.S. government and its citizens actively fought to suppress the nationalistic self-activity in black communities. It, quote, was then the consecration of a campaign of war and fraud by the American community against the new class of recently emancipated Africans, wrongfully and illegally to prevent the new class from exercising the full range of political liberty that belonged to it. Indeed, the 14th Amendment attempts to order the new class into American communities. Worse still, quote, that membership would be limited politically and socially, end quote. He continues by quoting, "It is not too strong to say that all this was and is war," end quote. So too were the various acts of resistance against the dominant nation. Murders of human traffickers, slave owners, and overseers, organized rebellions, individuals and collective escape attempts by enslaving peoples, and their volunteering to fight for various military entities that promised freedom or improved conditions may factor into this framework, alongside attempts to immigrate, the form homestead and black towns, and more recent efforts to protect black communities against lynching, bombings, and police brutality. One may also include in this the creation of organization, clubs, and protest movements, as well as urban rebellions in locales such as Watts, Detroit, and Louisville, Kentucky. The shootouts at New Bethel and Lewis Street were two of the most famous New African skirmishes in this war, and for some, they were snapshots of the routine repression executed by the oppressive forces battling against the New African International Movement. Framing the movement in these terms allowed New Africans to include in their discussion New African political prisoners and prisoners of war. It legitimized this choice by some to dedicate their skills and resources to the military aspects of the movement. For the students of social movement, the conflict between the U.S. state and New African further reveals the consequences of attempting to live according to the values and goals of the New African independence movement. Episodes of Violence is next. Welcome in. I'm gonna look back. Oh no! Good, I have my finger still on it. Look at me, getting better. Yeah, right? Exactly, Vaughn. They know everything about it. All right, here we go. Episodes of Violence. New Africans and law enforcement participate in several overt violent interactions between the 1969 New Bethel incident and
have to go
one raid on Republic New African.
Oh, you can't do this. So I went.
Police planned some such as the raids in 1971 on the Lewis and Lynch in the Lynch Street houses. Others, like the New Bethel incident, seem to be more spontaneous. Regardless of the forethought, these occurrences demonstrate how covert repression and legal maneuvering, such as traffic stops, support deadly repressive actions. Both soft and hard repression also helped alter versions that figured into New African collective identity and became powerful in undesired aspects of lifestyle politics. The New Bethel incident and that was this big, huge shootout that they had. You know what I mean? So yeah. The New Bethel incident is by far the best known event in New African independence history. That fateful evening revealed a deep, long-held tension between police and black communities. It reminded all involved that activist formation, willingly to challenge the status quo, were especially vulnerable to violent encounters due to long-standing abuse and misgivings about armed representatives of the state. More concretely, many black Detroiters were distrustful of the police because of the violence local law enforcement inflicts in their neighborhoods. Police brutality and poor housing conditions and the lack of substantive response to black Detroiters needs fueled that tension, especially in the aftermath of the 1967 rebellion. Further, job and housing discrimination and illegal drugs wreak havoc on many individuals and helped facilitate the, quote, blightening of many urban black communities. And Detroit is just one of the many cities that exemplify this problem. Various people from New York, for example, have given similar descriptions on the conditions that typify locales where black people became involved with the Republic of New African consulates. Put simply, many New Africans who lived in such conditions and witnessed and or experienced anti-black policing had a reasonable expectation that confrontations with policing agencies were not far off. Therefore, it is not surprising, especially in hindsight, that some were prepared to defend themselves in such an event. Yeah. The death of Chaka Fuller is perhaps also less surprising years after the shootout, trials, and subsequent acquittals. Policing agencies had been on guard against New Africans, partially due to the presence of the Black Legion. Within months of its founding convention, the provisional government began to organize an army with a chain of command in uniforms, regular training and recruitment strategies. As it organized, the Legion quickly caught the FBI's attention. Go figure. Although it no doubt caused concerns, there was no strong directive indicating on how to handle this army/security force. As Assistant Attorney General J. Walter Wegley wrote to Hoover, stating, quote, it would appear that the expressed intent of the captioned organization and some of its leaders would fall within the ambit of 18 YSC 2389. Section 2389 makes unlawful the recruiting of soldiers or sailors within the United States, or the establishment of recruiting stations for enlisting of soldiers and sailors to engage, to serve in any manner in armed hostilities against the United States. However, this only recommendation was that Hoover notified him if the Bureau decided to take significant action, perhaps because the Legion seemed to operate more as a security group than as a regular army. Regardless, local and federal law enforcement were on edge. U.S. law enforcement also may have had reasons to suspect that more violence would follow the New Bethel incident. In one report, police officers claim that doctors who treated a wounded officer received threats of bodily harm. No details accompanied the report, but other claim had a little more substance. In this case, police expected, quote, an uprising within the boundaries of the 10th precinct, end quote. Rather, that uprising was understood as a, quote, riot or a protest is not specified. However, an informant for the police claimed that New Africans planned to incite Detroit police to use their weapons to harm and unalive participants at the support rally of Judge George Crockett, a black jurist who had released over 100 New Bethel arrestees hours after the death of Officer Zepesky. I don't know if I said it right. Kazewski. I don't know. Like many of the other reports, no substantial details accompany the allegation. If the New Africans discussed having a demonstration in the aftermath of the New Bethel incident, it is likely that they discussed the potential of police assaults on the demonstrators, as well as the potential effects police brutality could have on people who constantly witnessed and were recipients of misconduct at the hands of lawmen. As if the informant report, some New Africans were indeed willing to provoke deadly violence against protesters, it would have been an attempt to demonstrate the consistency of police brutality against African people colonized in urban locales such as Detroit. Like their southern counterparts who dramatized the violence inherent in racial and apartheid, opening one's self up to public police violence would have been intended to provoke moral outrage for witnesses while demanding that what New Africans believe was the only solution to such problems, the creation of a black nation in the Deep South. It is not likely, even if some suggest provoking police violence against demonstrators, that many New Africans would have supported the idea. In fact, New Africans were attempting to be more cautious of the aftermath of the New Bethel incident. Some Legionnaires, especially top-ranking members, were reportedly planning to go underground and even wear a different type of uniform than those who remain above ground. One police memo stated that Brother Gandai Gade, I can't say it, openly considered moving the Republic of New African headquarters to Cleveland, where the situation was not as, quote, hot as Detroit. Openly courting police violence also would have had a negative impact on the case of Detroiters Chaka Fuller, Alfred Habet, and Raphael Vera, a teacher from New York, who eventually went to trial for their suspected involvement in the New Bethel incident. Habet's charges included unlawful possession of a weapon, but Fuller's and Vera were charged with criminal assault and murder. Vera and Fuller arose victoriously from their trials by September 1970s, after which Vera headed back home to New York City and Fuller remained in Detroit. Both New Africans had received death threats, and someone quickly made good of their threat to Fuller when the unidentified assailant stabbed him to unaliving just outside his home less than 1 month after his acquittal. Damn. New Africans and other community members claimed that police committed the murder to avenge Officer Kompexi's death. The murder has yet to be solved, but Fuller's death confirmed many New Africans' fears that the police were willing to kill them in revenge. If not, we'll make sure. Cool. If not pure spite. According to former Legionnaire Bollingon Anderson, quote, "That's one of the reasons why when I got out of prisons, I didn't go back here to Detroit. Because during the time that I was in prison, one of the pigs that I had wounded in a gun battle, they were talking about making me police chief. So I said, well, I know I can't go back. Yeah, so that's why I paroled in New York when I got out." As Elder Balungan's statement indicates, antagonism between, quote, the law and New Africans posed a serious threat for known citizens and parliamentary cadres. Not only did they have to fear police harassment, imprisonment, and even death, they also had to consider leaving their communities and families in search for safety, because they remained targets sometimes even after they discontinued participating in the political actions that originally placed them on the state radar. In other words, the consequences of participation in the New African Independence Movement often extend beyond a person actually involved with the movement. It impacts their entire lives, forcing them to carefully consider their life choices. FBI-backed headlines and wildness, they used the H word, about the New Bethel incident spread across the nation, triggering a brief surge of covert repressive action against New Africans. As they traveled to and from meetings, police departments and federal agents took license plate numbers and recorded their home address, as well as their addresses of family and friends. By the time New Africans made it to Jackson, Mississippi, where they established their headquarters, the U.S. government had gathered much intelligence on their activities across the nation. The FBI continued to generally surveillance and began in August 1970. The Mississippi Sovereignty Commission placed a watchful eye on New Africans in its states. At least one FBI agent watched New Africans regularly, and with the consent of Mississippi state leadership, the FBI participated in several overt actions, including sanctioning Ku Klux Klan harassment of New Africans, attempting to prevent the March 29th, 1971 land dedication ceremony from taking place, pressuring black landowners Lofton Mason into nullifying his agreement to sell the land to the provincial government and attempting to provoke violence. They may have succeeded when Larry Jackson, a Legionnaire, forcibly removed Davis Smith, a hostile white reporter, from a press meeting. Smith ended up accusing Obadell and Jackson with misdemeanors assault at an FBI's behest. But both New Africans were convicted and paid fines. Fucking hell. Just because they wanted to remove somebody. Taken together, each of these hostilities interactions placed New Africans in the state of psychological unease, similar to that which Killingham and Simmons describe. Like New Africans in Detroit, surrounded in 1960 shootout, the tension caused many to become paranoid, some beyond or perhaps within reason. Consider the episode related to Saku Owusa, I think, who traveled with the group from New York to the land dedication ceremony at El Malik's in 1971. We had meetings, this is what he said, we had meetings and the police were patrolling and following everybody. And one guy from New York, he got recruited to come down and he was riding with his older brother and the cops were messing with them and they were messing with the cops, playing a cat and mouse game. Whatever was going on, this brother that came down from New York, he couldn't handle it. He flipped out. And so they took him to the hospital. I heard he was in the hospital. So I went to see him and visit him. And there he was, lying in the hallway. He hadn't had a room yet. And he was pointing at the light bulb saying, quote, God is white, God is white, God is white. Oh, Jesus. If what happened to this man was a serious case, one should expect that several other New Africans experienced some degree of psychological trauma related to their experience with being continually followed and sometimes harassed and surviving intense interactions such as the one described. An atmosphere of group preparedness for an attack, along with individual mental trauma and being harassed by various law enforcement and vigilante groups, creating a mixture of combustible elements that was designed to explode with the correct trigger. Brother Amir expressed concerns regarding the validity, got it, surrounding New African citizens' presence. Although some local journalists and police considered their move to Jackson as an attempt to foment violence. He argued that New Africans were not interested in having, quote, a shootout war over the land. Just looking down, make sure I didn't miss anything. Looks like I didn't miss anything. Hello, Tribble. Hello, Two-Spirit. He claimed publicly that, quote, the New African cadre was okay, I gotta look at this word, everybody. Arbi Ratbak. I gotta highlight it though. Alright, right back, everybody. Proselytizing, teaching, organizing for the reparation vote. Peace, he claimed, quote, proselytizing, teaching, organizing for the reparation vote. Peace, he claimed, quote, not shooting wars, end quote, was the best way to proceed. In fact, Obadell had been sensitive about the press response to the Republic of New Africa for some time. A reliable informant for the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission reported as early as July 31st, ABX, of the previous years that Obadell was upset about the Jackson Daily News characterization of the RNA has have a quote propensity towards violence. He seems shocked that they would characterize him and his cadres in such a matter. For the historian, however, it comes as no surprise that the mainstream media would be hostile. After all, New Africans were struggling to remove 5 states from the established country, even as they promoted an approach of utilized legal channels to pursue their goals. They also prepared for armed revolution. Not only was Amir Abedel a leader of a nationalist movement with a reputation of antagonism towards police, but he also had a poor reputation within some segments of the New African Independence Movement. His brother Agadi and the RNA's first president, among others, viewed him as a reckless and unreasonable violent. Such a view from top leaders surely contributed to the belief that Brother Amir was a suicidal militant. Williams may have even expressed suspicions that Brother Amir was an agent provocateur, that Amir Abedel was accused of planning a bomb at the U.S. Metropolitan Airport, caused some of his leading comrades to view him with disdain. Because Abedel was a ranking leader in the independence movement, opponents of the provincial governor also associated him with the New Bethel incident. Some may have been aware of several underground actions in which New Africans participated and sometimes initiated in Detroit, Michigan, Cleveland, Ohio, and Cairo, Illinois. Although these actions did not garner the same attention as New Bethel state and federal policing agencies, likely notified political leaders in Mississippi to each occurrence. Finally, Obedel's public actions and statements sometimes betrayed his claims that his mission was a purely peaceful one. In the midst of Robert F. Williams' 1969 detainment in London, Obedel, when Midwest Vice President, reportedly met with the British Consul General in Detroit. During that meeting, newspapers and the FBI alleged Obedel demanded a formal apology and threatened, quote, possible military appraisal by the Black Legion against countries flying the Union Jack in the Western Hemisphere. In a speech of Beloit College, Obedel indicated that the provincial government's move to Mississippi would be a violent one because local white people, like their counterparts throughout Michigan, were organizing around armed militants and had constantly used them against black people. Therefore, quote, we understand that from the moment we arrive, there must be war. And so the quote, the Black Legion is prepared in America, just as the New African citizens were prepared to repressed action. Policing agencies anticipated something like what took place in Jackson, Mississippi on August 18, 1971. The gunfire that would affect the course of the Republican New African organizing for the remainder of the decade burst from the New Africans. Residents at 1138 Lewis Street at approximately 6:30 a.m. on what warm sunny morning, 4 of the 7 New Africans who were present responded to tear gas canisters crashing through the walls and their residents with rifles fire as they engaged in a decisive battle with the police and FBI in what they considered a desperate attempt to preserve their lives. 3 others searched in vain for the safe route of escape. So they were defending themselves, like always. After about 20 minutes of shooting and the fatal wounding of 1 police officer, the seven surrendered, half naked and handcuffed. The men and women were marched down Lewis Street by their police escorts. It was a sight that many compared as images of enslaved Africans being marched to market for sale. Nearby at 1320 Lynch Street, Brother Amir and 3 others surrendered to the police and federal agents who had surrounded their office. Not one bullet exited a New African agent's or police officer's gun. However, the circumstances of that interactions were no more peaceful than the episode that occurred several blocks away. One by one, each person walked slowly from the residence with raised hands. At a certain point, law enforcement ordered them to lie face down on the morning concrete, where they had bound and thoroughly searched. Aside from the humiliating methods of arrest, the New Africans from Lynch Street reported receiving beatings once in police custody. These arrests solidified the state of Mississippi's victory in its effort to prevent the captive black nation from achieving independence. In addition to capturing the provincial government Republican New African president, that when diverted many resources away from nation building to legal defense, according to the Republican New African 11, quote unquote. Again, demonstrating the organizational and personal cost some social movements activists paid as they worked towards their goal. The New Bethel incident and the Jackson shootout were two of many violent interactions between the state and black revolutionaries during the Black Power era. The consequences of those battles include the loss of life and injury of New Africans, police officers, and FBI agents, and many others. They included New African imprisonment, destruction of activists and community property, and the stagnation of Republican New Africans' growth and development, not to mention contributing to the general perception of New Africans as violent criminals. In many ways, the U.S. government achieved its objectives through its strategy of surveillance and repression. However, its program did not crush the provincial government Republic of New Africa or the New African independence movement. The program has not yet won the U.S. government the war, or some citizens continue to pursue independence from behind the walls of prisons across the United States. Those who remained on the outside utilized the images of their imprisoned comrades to mobilize for New African liberation. That's pretty good. I like that. I like that section. North Carolina needs to be in there. You got to talk to the movement. Talk to the movement, my friend. Because I think they added Florida, like South Florida. Not sure. Either north or south. I can't remember which Florida they. Can't remember. Hello. Political prisoners and prisoners of war is the next section we're going to go over. Free. Popular recollections of black freedom activism, associated arrest and incarceration with brave nonviolent actions that utilize the moral high ground to expose the shortcomings of what activists and their supporters considered a broken but salvageable system. We remember neatly dressed men, women, and children as heroes who exposed openly bigoted police chiefs and shamed America for its hypocrisy. Yeah. We hailed them for forcing ignorant citizens to better align political and social practices with the virtuous American creed, such as rendering the civil rights history, when left here, ignores the fraught relationship between people of Africa descent, captive, and the law in the United States. Prominent thinkers throughout U.S. history equated blackness with the state of criminality and developed manifold images of black criminality to neutralize the bondage of African peoples and their descendants. When the civil rights activists sought incarceration, they hoped to undermine that painfully created but effortlessly maintained equation, yeah. For their willingness to put their bodies in harm's way, they faced hardships that were endemic to captivity in the prison system. And carceral spaces then were sites where black activists challenged fear, and fought the enduring stigma of the black criminal, even as they were defined by confinement, loss of autonomy, and torture. For self-proclaimed black revolutionaries, the hostilities that characterized that relationship between the state and its challengers was as severe. However, the liberation efforts of those black revolutionaries did not earn the same perception of moral authority that people like Fanning Lou Hamer and Martin Luther King Jr. commanded. The nature of their challenge and a political culture that valued, quote, law and order above social justice made new African appeals to morality and righteous acceptance in incarceration less effective than the efforts of Southern civil rights activists in the early 1960s. Therefore, by the end of the decade, administrators of federal and local governments worried very little about answering for the treatment of political radicals. Activists understood this enduring reality and built their strategies in line with it. Citizens of the captive New African nation and their allies considered people such as the Republic of New African 11, Dr. Mutulu Shakur, Geronimo Jai Jangai, and Safia Bukhara to be political prisoners and or prisoners of war, POWs. They received such statuses because they were conscious fighters of the people's struggles against colonialism and for national self-determination and independent state power. According to imprisoned New Africans, theorist Owasuo Yakakabua, quote, New African political prisoners and prisoners of war have sworn a general allegiance to the nation and its objectives, and sworn a particular allegiance to one of the formations of New African independence movement. Thus, all POWs were also considered prisoners, where's that one, PP? Political prisoners. But not all political prisoners are POWs. The distinctions rest on how the individuals were apprehended as well as their activities prior to and during the course of their capture. POWs include imprisoned military participants of the New African nation. More specifically, New Africans POWs, quote, are armed anti-colonial combatants. They are members of a structured military arms of political organization. They are commanded by persons responsible for their subordinates. They adhere to international humanitarian laws, i.e., they meet all criteria of said law, and they should be accorded prisoners of war status and treatment by the U.S. For example, Dr. Shakira and Jai Jega became POWs because of their involvement with the underground military operations of the Black Liberation Army, BLL. And for Jai Jaga, a Panther Underground, and Safia Bakura's participation with the BLL, as well as her arrest and conviction following the convenience store shootout that led to her capture, qualified her as a POW. In other words, POWs have to be involved directly with some sort of military formation, or had to be apprehended during a military action, whether planned or circumstantial, in order to guarantee that status. On the other hand, prisoners of war were individuals whose imprisonment was a result of state targeted, regardless of whether they participated in military action. Prisoners of war, political prisoners and prisoners of war were important topics of discussion to participants in the 1968 convention that led to the founding of the Provisional Government Republic of New Africa. It occurred after several parliamentary formations had organized for the purpose to defend black communities and eventually fight in armed warfare that some were certain would soon be upon them. With the goals of political independence, such formations could cohere into a national army and seek legitimacy under international law. That international recognition would theoretically give any defensive or offensive military action and political standings they needed to protect individuals from criminal persecution. However, it was and remains an unreliable strategy in U.S. courts. No new African political prisoner, or prisoner of war was received such status or protection from U.S. criminal persecution. Nor is it there evidence to suggest that the people who invoked legal protection under international law convinced their jurors to doubt the legitimacy of a given defendant's legal proceedings as a criminal. In fact, the United States continues to proclaim that it has no political prisoners. Of the many prisoners, political prisoners and prisoners of war, two of the most recognizable among them are Sadati Akula and Assata Shakur. The two BLL cadres became POWs in 1973 when New Jersey police officers captured them. Although the full details of their encounters with law enforcement remain unclear, it began with a traffic stop and resulted in the deaths of Zadi Shakur and officers Warren Forster. Rest in power, Assata Shakur. Everybody remember Assata Shakur, rest in power. I'm glad they were safe in Cuba and hopefully lived a good life. At least her family was able to visit her. During the melee that occurred, Assata was shot with her hands raised above her head and taken prisoner. Since her capture, Shakur has become an international symbol in an anti-imperialist struggle against the United States. Her dedication to improving the conditions of black people while she was a Black Panther, and her previous status as a soul of the Black Liberation Army contributed to her visibility. But because of her legendary escape from Clinton Correctional Facility and the bounty offered for her return, dead or alive, to the New Jersey Shakur powers as a former POW and a symbol as someone who beat the system has grown exponentially. She's based as fuck. Her status as a symbol has placed her in the likeness of George Jackson. Oh God, I love George Jackson. And other who gave momentum to the prison movement. For his part, Aklai fled, but authorities soon captured and imprisoned him. He has since become one of the most articulate theorists in prison struggles and architects of radical political organization, bringing those on the outside and those within the belly of the beast. Because even in the prison system, they have criminals, they have an economic system, and like even criminals, even the people in the prison system need liberation, complete liberation for people that are imprisoned, honestly. The prison, yes, thank you, Vaughn. Win Assata Shakur, win George Jackson. Rest in power, both of them. A prison experience became the impetus of Chokwe's Lumumba, Safia Bakura cadre from the African People's Party, APP, and many others to create international solidarity for African prisoners of war and the Jericho movement. Solidarity Day activities took place on March 30th to the 31st, 1973, and boosted the involvement of the National Black Political Convention. Comedian Derek Gregory, Julian Bound, and several liberals and left nationalist political organizations organized, articulated, and stated purposes. 1. Expose the nature of the pseudo-legal political persecution of African liberation fighters in the courts of the United States of America and other imperialists. 2. To provide an opportunity for all political prisoners of war committees to raise money to support for their particular political prisoners or prisoners of war. The New Africans continued to carry on their demands for retrying and releasing prisoners of war, political prisoners and prisoners of war, as they worked from behind the scenes outside prisons' walls to support the incarcerated. Their efforts, and especially the dedication of long-held prisoners, Jalila Montequem led to incarcerations of the Jericho 98, which evolved into the Jericho movement, also called because New Africans and their allies marched around the White House. Activists seek to gain, quote, recognition of the fact that political prisoners and prisoners of war exist inside the United States, despite the United States government continued denial and winning amnesty and freedom for these political prisoners. Some activists in Jericho and elsewhere hope to use evidence of government misconduct from the COINTELPRO era and other illegal government tactics to vindicate Akula and others whom activists argued were unjustifiably imprisoned or improperly sentenced. Some of them seek the eventually abolish prisons altogether. See, like, political prisoners exist. Ugh.
We don't have political prisoners. Not at all.
Sorry. One may construe the continued fight for the release of new African prisoners and the struggle for the abolition of the current prison system as beneficial outcomes of Black Power era liberation struggle. Because so many people remain behind bars for their beliefs and actions, younger generations are gaining a more sophisticated understanding of political repression and of the carceral system as a tool for social political control. Accompanying that educational outcome, however, is the devastating loss of many talented individuals who could have a more active role in betterment of society if they were not locked away in state-run and ever-increasing private prisons. Like the situation Balagon Anderson described, incarcerated activists cannot maintain the same human relationship as their counterparts on the outside. However, in their positions, they are able to better expose the general conditions endured by criminalized persons across the spectrum of political beliefs. Reflecting on her own incarceration, Asada stated, quote, one of the most, I mean, just raging pains that I had has being separated from my child, as being forbidden to hold her, to touch her, to breastfeed her. The conditions of women in prisons in the United States is just unbearable, end quote. The loss of parents, not to mention doctors, lawyers, chemists, musicians, scholars, and farmers who could have solved many of the society's problems as a better consequence of social movement activism, seeks to remove territories that an existing state claims its own. Their removal, however, could not diminish their love for the people, nor has it extinguished their dedication of humankind. That's what the state does. It takes away these people so they cannot progress and advance further. You know what I mean? Fucking purposely done. Humanity enact. New African response to state repression. New Africans anticipated some level of state repression and violent warfare with the United States government, and so they planned for it. Some may argue that they even instigated or courted conflicts within the state. New Africans consider themselves revolutionaries who, in a struggle for self-determination, made calculated decisions that they believed would help them achieve their goals. Amir Abdel hoped that by the time violent struggle became the reality, the provincial government, Republic of New Africa, would have enough international backing and second strikes, quote unquote, or underground military support to make any violent offensive by the United States costly in terms of human life, property, and international standing. However, because they did not develop either to a degree that would allow them to be militarily successful, New Africans had to find other ways in dealing with violent repression, and how they did so helped many maintain their humanity. Miriam, are you in the thing? I'm so sorry, Miriam. My fault. Here you go, Miriam. Wait.
السلام عليكم.
Alaikum salam, Miriam. I hope you're doing well.
بارك الله بيك يا أخي، الله يوفقك يا رب، الله يطول عمرك يا رب. إني أحتاج المساعدة يا ابني، الله يوفقك. إذا حد يقدر يساعدني هدية.
Please help Miriam and help the other guests. Please, 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 everybody. If you can, of course. Not long after the Lewis Street shootout, 3 new Africans began a trip to Jackson, Mississippi in order to do, quote, party work. Instead, it culminated with their arrival in Cuba as part of a large phenomenon that began the previous decade. On November 8th, 1971, Fila, oh my gosh, here we go, Olatunja, former slave named Charles Hill, and Michael Manchu, quote unquote, Finney, were journeying from Berkeley, California, where they were students, teachers, Vietnam veterans, parents, and revolutionaries. Somewhere near Albuquerque, they met with Ralph Atara Goodwin. The 3 were working for the provisional government, and at least one, Finney, had also been a member of the Black Panther Party. They headed towards Jackson, Mississippi with a cache of weapons and multiple other items that suggested they were prepared to be off the grid for a number of days. At some point, New Mexico State Troopers Robert Rosenblum pulled them over. The encounter ended with Rosenblum dead from a gunshot wound. Police found the vehicle abandoned early the next morning. Nearby, quote, the cache was found in heavy weeds and brushes, end quote. It, quote, contained back militant literature, primarily of the Republic of New Africa, end quote, and an unspecified number of, quote, semi-automatic rifles, shotguns, homemade bombs, end quote. This is all for educational purposes. Yeah. In addition to personal items, among the personal items were pamphlets about Africa, Malcolm X quotes, utensils, and food included 1 slice of pumpkin pie. I like pumpkin pie, I'm sorry. The New Africans then spent almost 3 weeks figuring out how to avoid capture by authorities in what journalist authority Lappy called, quote, the largest manhunt in New Mexico's history, end quote. And in the meantime, quote, all undeveloped, they used the G word, informants and black extremist sources, as well as all criminal informants, were contacted in regard to this case, end quote. Police maintained heavy surveillance, setting up roadblocks and conducting door-to-door investigations in neighborhoods along all possible routes of escape. On November 27th, after waiting in sand dunes for the opportunity to flee their predators, the young soldiers forced a tow truck driver to take them to Albuquerque Airport, where they commandeered a Chicago-bound flight, and the 3 new Africans detoured the plane to Tampa, where they allowed the flight passengers to deplane. After refueling, they forced the plane and its 6 members flight crew to Havana. Once in Cuba, quote, the men settled into quiet lives as guests of the revolution. Nice, they got away! Yay! Just for TikTok, right? Just for TikTok. During the 1960s and the early 1970s, rerouting flights from various locales to Cuba became one popular method of revolutionaries and other self-made enemies of the United States used to avoid arrest, imprisonment, and death. In many of those cases, the Cuban government accepted Cuba, while returning planes. They returned the planes, pilots, and passengers to their destinations. That's cool. We just want you to, that's how we do it. That's how we do it. That's how we do it. Those whom Castro's regime did not accept found themselves jailed and then returned to U.S. custody. skyjacking became so popular during the 1960s that Castro and Nixon governments sought ways to deter both countries' exiles from seeking refuge in their respective countries. And after what appeared to be a, quote, downward trend in hijacking, Cuba reached out to the United States to negotiate a resolution to deal harshly with people who divert planes and boats to either country with hopes of finding asylum. Besides the 3 new Africans mentioned above, several Black Panthers also utilized skyjacking to Cuba method when they were in the bind. It is unknown whether the 3 men realized during their escape to Cuba that they would spend the remainder of their lives in the island country. However, for 2 of them, that was a considerable consequence of giving their lives when necessary to in pursuit of independent Black nation state. Not long after arriving in Cuba, Goodwin unalive during a heroic attempt to save 2 drowning beachgoers. Finney also died in Cuba, though 2 decades after arriving there. His cause of death was throat cancer. Aww. Alatujayi remains in Cuba, seemingly bitter in his freedom in exile. Like famed Black Panthers Pete O'Neill, who has lived in Tanzania for several decades. Olatunji has expressed deep appreciation of the Cuban government's willingness to protect him. However, he has claimed on more than one occasion that he would rather be in the United States with his family and friends. Not everyone decided or was able to escape U.S. authorities' legal reach. Therefore, New Africans and BLL cadres, Black Liberation Army cadres, sometimes had to fight the state on its own territory. One method of combat was to utilize U.S. courts, New African lawyers, such as Chakwi Lumumba, defending their comrades in the courtroom while demonstrating the political nature of the defendant's cases to jurors. However, the method often led to imprisonment. According to Assata Shakur, quote, "We couldn't look to the courts." They put a K, by the way, in front of the courts. For freedom and justice any more than we could expect to gain our liberation by participating in the U.S. political system. And it was pure fantasy to think we could gain them by begging, end quote. Based as fuck. They had to consider other options because so many Black revolutionaries became inmates in state and federal prisons after being convicted of criminal offenses when faced with options to either pursue legal respite or flee. Many chose the latter option. For them, going underground was an important temporary and sometimes long-term alternative to whatever legal options they had available. Put another way, New Africans for the undetermined length of time sometimes found it important to help the North American anti-imperialist white revolutionaries. They created safe houses in various locales and devised ways of alter their appearance and change identities based. Sometimes they did so to achieve a specific long-term goal, such as securing money, as evidenced by the 1981 life for themselves, 1981 brinks of expropriation.
بليز ساعدني قلت يا عمو الله يوفقك يا رب.
I wish I had more.
هذا يا عمو بليز هدية.
Please help
الله
me.
يوفقك.
Otherwise, they sought to create a completely new life for themselves in the United States and or abroad. Assata Shakur provided a glimpse of what it was like to go underground. Although her autobiography does not describe the actual process or the people who helped her, of course it wouldn't, take that step before and after her capture and imprisonment, it provides readers with details and heavy tolls associated with that life. So everybody, I have a book recommendation. Read Assata's biography. Read her biography, Assata. Read it. Very important. She stated, quote, sisters and brothers from just about every revolutionary or militant group in the country were either rotting away in prison or had been forced underground, end quote. The comparison between, quote, rotting away in prison and being forced underground invites readers to consider the lived experience of an underground revolutionary. Like being imprisoned or exiled in another country, those who lived underground could not associate freely with their families and loved ones, contradicting many people's intuitive desires to contact with the people they valued the most. Further, Asada said, I love Asada, quote, like most of us back in those days, I was new at this, learning about clandestine struggles as I lived it, end quote. It was unstable and stressful, partially because underground revolutionaries could not remain in one place consistently. Like the descriptions provided by many imprisoned revolutionaries who were constantly moved from prison to prison, Asada stated, quote, over the next few years, home became a lot of places, end quote. Eventually, the same repressive force that led to Asada's clandestiny also led to her imprisonment. But after surviving years in dungeon-like holding facilities, Asada escaped with the help of her BLA comrades and some white anti-imperialists. She eventually fled the United States as well, and since the 1980s, she has been living. I get what they're saying, that even though she escaped prison, she still was confined to a country, restricted in a sense, but free from, but at least free from those concentration camps for black people. So I understand what they're saying there too. But in a sense, she was freed, but in a sense, she was confined for safety reasons. And again, visited by her family. I'm glad that she had more freedom of movement and stuff, and not like put into a cage and stuff, and not being able to hold their child and stuff. So yeah, rest in power. Oh, no worries, take some meds. I understand. Mentions of wanted to survive. However, going underground and participating in an array of independent actions were simultaneously intended to chip away at their enemy's confidence and to build support for the Revolutionary War for the independence of the black nation. According to Revolutionary Armed Force Task Force RATF, the Black Liberation Army, quote, new African freedom fighters represent the first point of resistance for the black nation, end quote. These freedom fighters were brothers and sisters in struggle who had developed an analysis and a critique of the oppressor system, and as well as their own resistance to it through years of above ground and underground activism. Their critique led them to believe in the need for an army that would secure independence for the black nation. They had given their lives to struggle for their ideals, had become the target of government repression, and regardless of the cost, had refused to submit to their oppressor's will. Although primarily composed of New Africans and other black revolutionaries, the RATF also included several white anti-imperialist allies, including Kathy Bundin, David Gilbert, and Judy Clark, formerly of the Weather Underground. On October 20th, 1981, a wing of the RATF, also known as, quote, the family, participated in an armed, quote, expropriation of the Brinks truck as it made its scheduled cash pickup at the shopping mall in Newett, New York. During the expropriation, the Black Liberation Soldiers exchanged gunfire with the vehicle's guards, leaving one fatal wounded. The soldiers then proceeded to plan to a location where they would meet with their white comrades who were supposed to drive them to safety. However, the group members bungled their escape, and the resident college students witnessed the soldiers connecting with their drivers. The witnesses alert local authorities and describe the group members and their U-Haul trucks, which police soon stopped at the blockade. During the stop, the armed New African ambushed the police, unaliving two. Several of the expropriation participants, including Bundin, Clark, Gilbert, and Samuel Soul, quote-unquote, Brown, were captured at or near the scene of the shootout. In the series of raids and roundups, law enforcement captured more New Africans, and one, I wonder if that, Mataneria Shabaka Sandetta lost his life. That's sad. The raid on Sunni Ali's residence was just one of those that took place. By May 1988, all of the known... I was 8 years old. 8 years old. I was hardly, in the world. By 1988, all of the known participants have been tried and many sentenced, if still alive. I bet my family was so racist when if they fucking knew about any of this shit. I bet they were so goddamn racist. I bet you I was surrounded by racist white supremacists. Dr. Mutulu Shakur and Marilyn Buck were convicted on all of the various charges stemming from their involvement in the Brinks expropriation. Another 1981 I was 1 year old, armed car expropriation, and their alleged involvement of Assata Shakur, November 2nd, 1979. Ooh! Escaped from the Clinton Correctional Facility. That's almost in my February 24th, 1980. It's my birthday. Part of their conviction included conspiracy to commit and actually committing a racketeering influence and corruption organization conspiracy enterprise and participating in a RICO conspiracy, end quote. These later charges were important because they demonstrated how the radically ethnically heterogeneous jury comprehended the Black liberation family's actions. They framed the expropriation, quote unquote, as criminal, as opposed to political acts. The defendants and their lawyers failed in their attempts to change the jury's conceptualization that the radicals' activities were purely criminal. In a move similar to that of several Black liberation activists before them, some of the Brinks defendants challenged the legality of their trials as illegitimate citizens of the United States. The New Africans tried in vain to convince the courts that the U.S. government had no jurisdictions over them because their actions were political. Which theoretically protected them from a criminal trial under international law. New Africans defendant Chu Ferguson problematized his treatment as a U.S. citizen and used his claim as a non-American to argue that his trial in U.S. criminal court was unlawful. Like the attempts of Brother Amir Safia Bukhara and others that tactics did not produce the desired results for any of the defendant. Instead of all of the convicted soldiers spent at least some time in prison. Many of them included Gilbert and Dr. Shakur are still serving time. Oh, they're still serving time. Well, maybe not now, because this book came out, like, I think it might be unalived. I don't know. They're pretty old. All right, we're going to read one more. Wow, I got 20 minutes, but hold on. The consequences of political participations on the human being cited above may seem dire, because they remind readers of the hell some revolutionaries pay for their dedication to new African liberation. Some people were overly naive about the full power of the United States to undermine their efforts to free the land. As Bebe Khalid Adur Rashid stated, quote, as young people, we weren't prepared to go up against the country the way we did. We had no idea the kind of intelligent apparatus the United States had and put in place, end quote. However, many of the persons mentioned earlier were aware of the risk involved when they decided to give their lives, if necessary, to the goals they deemed valuable. In fact, they had planned for such outcomes, even though they certainly did not want to face imprisonment, exile, or death. Carefully planned and consideration of these outcomes were important for them as they strove to maintain their humanity during their struggle for liberation. Forethought and unintended consequences also helped shape new African lifestyle politics. The situations described in this chapter were also some of the extreme cases. As we have seen, the experience of those who did not participate in shootouts or who did not have to operate underground were much different, even if they were informed by such spectacular violence. They too likely made it into the numerous indexes of FBI agents and police officers. As people who were aware of being targeted, but who might not have been able to say specifically when and how they lived with the stress associated with the raids, shootouts, and removals of their comrades, yet knowing that they too could be staring down the barrel of a lawman's gun during a raid or facing a grand jury to testify against their comrades did not deter all of them from participating in the movement of independence. Instead, they continued to pursue their goals and lived to the best of their abilities within the contours of their political convictions. Even for those who eventually let go of the ideas of independence, the struggle for reparations continued, and at least immediately to demand their attention, time, and resources. And that's the end of that chapter. That was a good chapter. I think that was a good section. I love that section. That section was great, you know? And the thing is they might have like not understood, but through that experiences brings on and draws in better lines of how to take something on. You know, it advances I understand the experiences advance your conceptions and what to do next, in a sense. You know what I mean? Because if we look at revolutions, right, like the Russian and the Chinese Revolution, you look at that they had setbacks, they had mistakes, they had to do the experience in order to understand the mistakes and fix them. Because a pool of failures gives you the advancement of knowledge and how to do it better. You know? So like, yeah. Let's see here. I want to look at this real quick. I got 15 minutes, but I don't know. Hold on. Lama Isai. I could read the beginning. It's only like it's only like 3 pages. Interesting. I'm thinking, what's the next one? I don't know. Let's see, what's the next? The urban revolutionaries, provincial government formation in the New African Independence Movement. And this chapter is called The New African People's War, the Lessons and Legacies of the New African Independence Movement. You know what? I don't mind stopping early. Sounds like a good stopping point. Let's stop early today, because yesterday I was on time. So we stopped at 2:01. 2:01.